The dawn arrived. A dark cloud rose on the horizon, and the rain roared in the midst of it. The floodgates of the abyss were raised, and the waters burst forth like an army. And while it happened, a never-ending storm fell from the sky. The light of day turned to darkness. Brothers could not see one another, and the wind was so violent that no one could stand up. They all curled up like dogs, terrified of their imminent end. For 7 days, the storm struck the earth like it was going to break it apart. On the 7th day, the storm chattered like a pot, and the rain stopped. Atrahasis opened the hatch and a ray of light appeared. Humanity had returned to clay. His vessel rested upon a distant mountain. He released the animals, one by one, and watched as life returned to the earth. Myth of Atrahasis, Old Babylon, 18th century BC. The story you just heard is, of course, a major source of inspiration behind the text you now see on screen, the biblical flood narrative, found in the Pentateuch of the Jewish tradition. The oldest physical copies date to the 3rd century BC among the Dead Sea Scrolls, although the terminology and the context of its composition suggest that parts of it may have been written between the 8th and 5th centuries BC in Judah and during the Babylonian exile, respectively. Hello! Today I'm wearing a vest because we're going to be talking about the myth of the Great Flood. Thing is, Atrahasis is not the earliest version of the myth, because according to the Eridu Genesis, from around 2300 BC, an ancient Sumerian epic, deities created humanity to cultivate the soil, tend the herds, and perpetuate the worship of the gods. Cities were soon built, but for a reason that is still uncertain, assumed to be due to an excess of both human population and noise, the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. Enki, god of the rivers, who didn't agree with the decree, revealed it to Ziusudra, a heroic and pious man, and Ziusudra did what Enki commanded and instructed him to do, building a massive boat. He performs a sacrifice and then prostrates himself before the gods and an Enlil, and as a reward for living a pious life, Ziusudra is sent to paradise in the east, in the moon, and receives the gift of immortality. There is also the Babylonian adaptation from the 12th century BC of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where in tablet 11 we're told how Enlil causes the flood because he decides that humans have become as numerous as they are noisy. Utnapishtim does the same as Ziusudra in the Sumerian myth, and it is specified that he takes both domestic and wild animals, and uses birds, including a dove, to find dry land. He and his wife are the survivors of the mythological flood, having preserved human and animal life in the great ship he built. The couple were deified and sent to a faraway land, probably the moon, by the god Enlil once he calmed down, as a reward for paying attention to the divine instruction of building an ark. This was preserved in the library of the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal for more than half a millennium, and is the most complete source of the Epic of Gilgamesh and also the original flood myth of the Middle East. The other Mesopotamian version of the flood is the story I told you at the beginning about Atrahasis, in which the gods promise never again to destroy humanity in that way. It is preserved in fragmentary versions from ancient Babylon and Assyria, and these ancient mythical tales, beginning with Eridu, then Atrahasis, and thirdly Utnapishtim, have a close affinity with the biblical story of the flood, and they are the source of aspects of the biblical narrative, such as the construction and provisioning of the ark with humans and animals, his floating and descending of the raven and the dove, the sacrifice, the smell, becoming stranded on a mountain, as well as the role played by the human protagonist in the biblical account. And something very interesting about the flood is that there are many similar stories throughout the world. In Greece, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood, but Deucalion and Pyrrha are saved in a boat, advised by Prometheus, and their vessel ends up stranded on a mountain, from where they repopulate the world. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a divine being in the form of a fish, often identified as the god Vishnu, builds a boat and is saved from a cosmic flood, that renews humanity. In China, there are also accounts where colossal overflows of the waters or failures in the cosmic order cause floods that almost wipe out the entirety of humanity, and cultural heroes such as Yu the Great tame the waters by opening channels and giving rise to a new political order. In traditions from the Pacific Islands, the floods cover entire islands, from which only a few humans are saved in canoes or by climbing mountains, sometimes as punishment for having broken a taboo. Among peoples of Southeast Asia, such as groups in the Philippines or Borneo, there are stories of a flood that covers the entire land and leaves only one or two survivors alive, on high mountains or an elevated refuge. In various African cultures, the flood may originate from overflowing rivers, human negligence, or the wrath of a deity, and it usually contains common elements: massive destruction, the salvation of a small shaman, and the reconstruction of order. In some cases, the trigger is a reckless act, like moving sacred stones or cutting down a mythical tree, which releases the contained waters. In Mesoamerica, Nahua traditions recount successive destructions of the world, one of them by water, where only a man and a woman are saved in a hollowed out log or some kind of ark. The Maya in Mesoamerica speak of a great rain serpent, or of divine punishments that flood everything, due to human corruption, with a few survivors allowing the story to begin anew. In the Andes, there are Quechua and Aymara myths about a flood called Iloklai Pachacuti or Unu Pachacuti, the end of the world by water, which annihilates almost all of humanity, from which a couple or a small group escape in a box or an elevated refuge. Other peoples of the Americas, such as the Mapuche, also have a version of the flood myth. In this case, it occurs when two supernatural serpents, Tren Tren and Kai Kai, come into conflict. One raises the land to save humans, and the other one raises the water to destroy them, generating a flood from which only a few manage to survive. In traditions from the Amazon basin and the Guyanas, there are accounts in which gods or heroes provoke or stop giant floods by cutting down sacred trees, opening water sources, or moving stones that contain the waters. In almost all of these versions of the Great Flood, there are three motives that get repeated. First, a near total destruction by water, second, the salvation of a very small group, and third, the establishment of a new order. What changes, on the other hand, is the cause: divine wrath, mischief, cosmic imbalance, or simply the natural cycle of the world. Also variable are the scope, local versus global, and the type of refuge, whether an ark, a log, a mountain, or an island. There is also the Zoroastrian story of Jima from ancient Persia. They say that in ancient days, when the earth still whispered this youth, Ahura Mazda called upon Jima, the radiant king. He did not come with promises, but with a warning. A terrible winter will descend upon the world, a cold so vast that it will extinguish men, animals, and plants alike. Jima was not to build an ark, but a hidden refuge beneath the earth. The Vara, with his golden staff, he widened the earth and created a luminous sanctuary where he gathered the finest seeds and righteous men and women. Inside the Vara, the eternal light of Ahura Mazda imitated the sun, and time seemed to stand still. Outside, frost devoured mountains and froze rivers. Inside, Jima walked among his people like a silent father, guarding the world's last breath, awaiting the day when creation will be reborn. Although the myth is completely unrelated to water, it recalls the biblical flood of Noah. Both of them tell of a divine warning before a global disaster, the selection of the righteous, and the preservation of life in a special refuge. The moral structure and the purpose of saving creation are strikingly similar, but the myth of the Great Flood appears with variations in many traditions across the world. Greco-Roman, Indian, Chinese, African, Oceanic, among numerous indigenous peoples of the Americas, and you could go as far as to say that something similar appears in Persia. Not all speak of a universal flood in a strict sense, but they do recount overwhelming inundations or catastrophes that destroy almost everyone, while a few survive thanks to a supernatural warning or a specially prepared refuge. If a memory of the Black Sea flood did in fact influence the story of Gilgamesh, then it could also be a source for the story of Noah in the book of Genesis. Scholars have long noted remarkable similarities between the flood accounts in Gilgamesh and Genesis, and have suspected that the Israelites derived their version from the Epic of Gilgamesh or independently from a common tradition that may have arisen from a real catastrophe long before. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that the Black Sea suffered a catastrophic flood around 7,540 years ago, when the Mediterranean burst through the Bosporus, raising the sea level by as much as a foot per day on average for about 100 days. Although they do not claim a direct link to the flood myths of Gilgamesh or Noah, they suggest that the event could have had significant cultural impacts. Before the flood, the Black Sea was a freshwater basin surrounded by fertile lands, possibly inhabited by groups practicing early agriculture. The inundation would have displaced these populations, who would then have carried their agricultural knowledge into Anatolia, Greece, Central Europe, or maybe even Mesopotamia, coinciding with the agricultural and technological expansion that will culminate in the Copper Age. Evidence comes from seismic profiles, submerged shorelines, and sediments with freshwater shells beneath marine layers. Several archaeologists remain cautious, but some, like Douglas Bailey, believe that this forced migration could explain major cultural transformations in Europe, and of course, many are tempted to believe that it's possible that the Mesopotamian flood myth may have been a memory of this massive, gradual flood, but it is yet to be proven. The global diffusion doesn't necessarily imply a single historical origin, but it does suggest that large floods, whether fluvial, coastal, or rainfall-driven, have been recurring human experiences, reinterpreted symbolically as judgment from the gods, purification, or simply the world's restart within very different cultural frameworks. The Greek version of the flood myth was probably inspired by catastrophic floods in the Mediterranean, such as swells of the Evros River or tsunamis in the Aegean Sea. Geological evidence indicates that frequent earthquakes and sea waves could have wiped out an entire settlement, generating stories of total destruction and survivors in the mountains. The Indian Manu myth reflects seasonal flooding of the Indus or Ganges and catastrophic climate changes between 3000 and 1500 BC. Regular floods of sacred rivers will have affected agriculture, passed down as narratives of divine salvation and human renewal, incorporating religious symbols such as the god Vishnu and the fish later on. The Chinese one was obviously inspired by historical overflows of the Yellow River, which were as recurrent as they were devastating, affected populations and even stimulated massive hydraulic projects. The story of Yu reflects the memory of flood control and political centralization as responses to natural disasters, reinforcing the legitimacy of his power. The ones from Oceania, Southeast Asia and Africa likely emerged from tsunamis, cyclones or extreme monsoons that inundated low-lying islands. Seasonal variability and post-glacial sea level rise left evidence of destructive waves, remembered orally as divine punishments or trials. The Mesoamerican and Andes floodings may derive from hurricanes, intense rains and river overflows, Amazon, Orinoco or Andean lakes. The memory of catastrophic local destruction was transmitted through tales of survivors in logs, arks, or mountains. And the Persian one, although it doesn't involve water, reflects an extreme climatic event, plausibly the late glacial period, or simply severe winters in prehistoric Iran, and the underground vara is a symbolic interpretation of the storage of seeds and livestock to survive catastrophic conditions, similar to the preservation found in arks across the world. And all of this motivates us to contemplate another possibility, that the myths may have been inspired by large-scale floods associated with the end of the Ice Age. Several studies in paleohydrology and geomorphology, yes, those two things exist, I didn't even know, document catastrophic floods during the Holocene, both riverine and linked to glacial lakes and rapid coastal changes. Since the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, humans have enjoyed an unusually warm and stable geological period called the Holocene, and as a result, we have achieved great agricultural and cultural advances. But during the 2.6 million years prior, the world went through cycles lasting tens of thousands of years in which everything was much colder, and most of North America and Europe were locked beneath massive ice sheets several kilometers wide. If you've ever wondered why we spend most of our first 200 to 300,000 years on this planet essentially having boss fights every day with animals far lower level than us instead of building civilization, well, that's why. People tend to forget that other animals don't sweat, they overheat, they can keep up pace for hours under the sun, they don't have precise hands, they can build tools, can speak, can see as far as we do, and they don't hunt in coordinated groups. All of that at once. Humans are simply built different. The entire galaxy belongs to us by birthright. And because so much of the water of the earth was locked up as ice, sea levels were at least 100 meters lower than they are now, dramatically altering the shape of the continents. The ice sheets began melting around 16,000 years ago, causing sea levels to rise extremely fast. Faster than today's sea level rise caused by humans burning fossil fuels instead of using nuclear energy like someone with at least 2 brain cells, until the climate of the earth stabilized around 8,000 years ago. The collection of flood myths fit remarkably well as cultural memories of exceptional Holocene floods and the end of the last glaciation. Each region seems to have had its own local episodes of marine incursions, extreme river floods, and phases of highly unstable climate. The geological evidence for these megafloods is not equally strong everywhere, but there are certainly several lines of evidence supporting catastrophes that are, at least in spirit, compatible with the flood myths I mentioned earlier. Europe, Asia, the Americas, and even Oceania preserve geological evidence of this. Poorly sorted sands and gravels blanketing ancient soils in European valleys, channels cutting through terraces, which are signs of floods capable of wiping out entire regions. In monsoonal rivers in China and India, layers of slackwater deposits and buried paleochannels indicate water levels far higher than today, associated with intensifying monsoons and abrupt river course changes, consistent with traditional accounts of rivers changing their path. In the Himalayas, the Andes, and many Pacific and Southeast Asian coasts, there are traces of catastrophic draining, of dam lakes, and rapid rises in sea level that submerge coast and archipelagos. In South America, deposits linked to extreme El Niño rains are documented. Though no single piece of evidence matches a specific myth exactly, they do show that nearly all the regions that had a flood myth experienced a massive flood. Globally, the end of the Pleistocene and the early Holocene were marked by a sea level rise of more than 100 meters and by numerous large river and lake megafloods. From the perspective of communities living in coast, deltas, or fertile valleys, these men watching the world, their world, vanish underwater or change irreversibly within just a few generations. But if we had to pick a theory with the greatest chance of reflecting the biblical universal flood, then the culprits will be the 2 rivers that gave Mesopotamia its name, the Tigris and the Euphrates. At sites like Churupak, Kish, and Ur, thick alluvial layers have been documented, powerful levels of river flood silts, sometimes sandwiched between archaeological occupations, indicating flood events well beyond the normal regime of these rivers, and multiple times dated between 2900 and 2600 BC, right beneath levels containing tablets that mention the first historical kings of Sumer. This overlap between abrupt changes in sedimentary record and political transformation occurs precisely during major social shifts of the 3rd millennium BC, when the Sumerian king lists placed the antediluvian kings, long before the memory of these mighty rulers before the flood, who were said to have lived hundreds of years like those of the biblical Genesis, became fixed in Sumerian writing. This is also when the earliest versions of the flood myth, like the Genesis of Eridu, begin to take shape. In the low and very flat Sumerian plains, one extraordinary flood could easily have been experienced as a flood of the entire known world, a total reboot, with only a few survivors preserved in temples, raised tells, or even boats. This reflects the narrative structure of the Sumerian flood of Ziusudra, followed by Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, and finally Noah's Ark. Therefore, the suspects Tigris and Euphrates seem pretty guilty to me. Any objections? None? Tigris and Euphrates, I hereby declare you guilty of inspiring the great flood of the ancient Middle East. But even beyond that, geomythology and comparative mythology converge on the idea that the Great Flood motif arises again and again wherever water and climate have been especially extreme, and that many flood traditions blend memories of real disasters with moral, political, and cosmological interpretations. Therefore, rather than seeking a single origin event, it makes more sense to see the myth of the Great Flood as the symbolic crystallization of one or several large-scale disasters in different parts of the world. The afternoon sun radiates a glorious city. The air smells of clay, fire, and food. The loud chatter of travelers and merchants invade the ears of Hantili the Hittite and the Babylonian scribe. Welcome to Babylon, the city at the center of the world, where life is straightforward. Work hard, love me literature, love me Marduk, love me Ishtar. Simple as.
For a simple place, they are rather loud. Marduk eating Yanu.
I told you to call me Yanu.
Calm down, Lalitsi. I'm only joking.
Lalitsi. Here you speak to me in Akkadian, not that strange tongue of yours.
Nersilian Shuan Ansakantali. Shumatawansi Awansi.
What are you saying? Are you insulting me or invoking one of your 3 million gods? Huh, Lalitse?
See, I've already got you speaking the language of the Hatti.
Stop that nonsense. This is my house. I'm going to arrange my things. The market is behind you, just a few minutes from here.
I'll go and sell a little iron. If I'm lucky, I'll pass by here.
Alright, just a few rules. Don't try to cheat anyone with false measures. Here, that's paid for dearly. Don't enter a temple without a priest's permission. Don't go near the walls or any official building. Don't shout or insult anyone in the market. Don't draw your dagger unless your life
That's a long warning. Didn't he say life here was simple?
Don't bathe in the sacred canals. And of course, don't insult Ishtar or Marduk, or the Akkadian tongue for that matter. But in that case I will cut your head off myself. Hantili walked through the bustling market with the confidence of a man who knew what he was doing. Among the clay stalls and reed shops, his cargo of iron gleamed under the Babylonian sun. The merchants looked at him with a mix of awe and confusion, and Hantili, with his exotic accent, charisma, and exaggerated gestures, made every piece seem like a treasure from the gods.
Iron from the northern mountains, far better than bronze. Hard as stone, tougher than the walls of Babylon.
In just a few hours, he had sold a decent portion of his iron. With equal cunning, he bought copper at a good price, resold part of it, and even struck a few barter deals, leaving a fine chunk of silver in his purse. His smile was as wide as the Etemenanki itself. He earned even more than he expected. With the trade concluded, Hantili made his way back through the alleyways to Yanu's house. The scribe greeted him with a mix of wonder and resignation. Shaking the dust of his journey, Hantili spoke.
Yanu, my friend, you told me you knew Uruk. It wouldn't be a problem for you to take me there, would it?
And why will I do that?
First, you see this chunk of silver? It could be yours. And most importantly, I've heard more than once that there's no better hospitality and kindness in the world than that of a Babylonian. Is that a lie?
Well, thing is, it is not. It is our duty to help the less civilized peoples.
Shall we leave tomorrow?
And are we not going to rest? Those weeks of travel aren't going to recover themselves. We'll go in a few days. A whole day passed, then 2 and even 3, and finally the scribe gave in to Hantili's unbearable persistence, and on the way to Uruk, they walked through a dense forest. So, have you practiced your Akkadian?
Anaku yaku hurashi.
That was terrible. You're butchering my beautiful language. Anaku ulaku hurashi. It's not that hard.
I learned my Akkadian by speaking with Assyrians. They don't sound particularly melodious.
Assyrians? Those idiots who can't do anything but fight and shout?
At least they have an empire, unlike Babylon.
We can do far more than fight and conquer. We Babylonians are the center of culture and religion of all Akkadians. We are the masters of astronomy. And well, we're the best in literature. No one has an Epic of Gilgamesh. They never could. In no other language could they ever have an Epic of Gilgamesh. It's impossible. That can only be tasted in Babylonian. There are things that can only be known in Babylonian, in native Akkadian. Now, if you want to learn useless accents...
Then tell me more of the epic.
I've already told you everything.
You're lying to me. The Canaanite I mentioned spoke to me about a great flood. You never said anything about that.
Well, listen. The dawn arrived. A dark cloud rose on the horizon, and the rain roared in the midst of it. Janu continued the story of Atrahasis, and the hours passed, drawing them ever closer to Uruk, where it all began.